Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
And I'm Clayton Hunt. With us today is Lucas Casarez. Lucas is a fiduciary. That one, I was going to try and do it without messing it up.
Yeah, you got it right. I think you just froze after you said it.
Fiduciary. Okay. Lucas is a fiduciary, certified financial planner, and founder of Level Up Finance Planning, Power Up Tax Planning Services, and host of Techie Personal Finance Bootcamp. He specializes in serving tech professionals who want to maximize their financial opportunities to live their best lives today, while having confidence that their future will be awesome too. Welcome, Lucas.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, real quick, why don't you give us a background on kind of how you got into the finance industry and what led you to where you are today?
Sure, yeah. So when I graduated high school, I had no clue what I was doing or what I wanted to do. And I ended up working for a community bank back in Illinois, where I'm originally from. And what happened was I was doing community college, having my work pay for part of my school to help keep down student loan debt and things like that. But then I got really interested in the 401k, employee stock purchase plan, and things like that I had at that bank. And so that's what kind of sent me in the direction of how do I become a financial planner? And then once I found out that there's programs and things I could do, I ended up going to CSU in Fort Collins and becoming a financial planner through that route, and still working my way through school at that point in time. And this is kind of where I got exposed to tech professionals. Because when I was going to school working here in Fort Collins, Colorado, I started working at a credit union called First Tech Federal Credit Union. And they're the credit union for a lot of big kind of tech companies like Intel, HP, all the different versions of HP now, Avago, which is now Broadcom. And so lots of large tech companies. I was working there, getting exposure to that. Once I finished my program, I actually ended up working for a financial planner who specialized in all those kind of tech professionals. And so I got the exposure to stock options, RSUs, layoff packages, and all that fun stuff too.
Fantastic. I have no idea some of the words you just said.
Yeah, we can definitely dive into throughout the course of the episode as far as what some of those things would look like and what to do if you run into them, if you've never had exposure in the past.
Yeah, with that, my mother tried to get me interested in personal finance when I was younger. When myself and my sister were young, she actually set us up with accounts at the credit union that she was a member of. She was in state government for many, many years and retired there. She also set us up with her own personal financial planner, and set us up with savings plans and 401ks and those types of things. I'm a little disappointed in myself that through my later teen years and early 20s and maybe longer than that, I didn't contribute as much as I probably could have or should have into those types of accounts. That's about the extent of my knowledge, is that if I had contributed early to those programs, I would be in better shape now. So surely there's more to it than that. I know that we're going to talk about debt and emergency expenses and things like that throughout the show, but kind of walk us through what are the typical problems you see, or the missteps, or the issues that a lot of people, maybe even a lot of people in the tech industry, that you see from them.
Yeah, so the biggest one, and it matches up perfectly kind of with the listeners of the show, having six figures being a high probability of your income. What happens is, before you got to that six-figure mark, you were probably in college. You might have not went directly into that six-figure mark right out of college. And so you probably started at 50, 60, 70,000, but it quickly ramped up. And what happened was you had that lifestyle creep that happens to all Americans. You turn on the radio, you listen to Pandora. If you drive in your car, you're going to hear commercials of people trying to sell you things and tell you that your life is going to be so much more awesome if you just buy this one additional product, add this additional line item to your monthly expenses every single month. And so the biggest thing by far, especially to the segment that's listening to your podcast, is that lifestyle creep that occurs. So if you were used to living off 50,000 and having a good life, and you have the same amount of kind of joy that you have now as you're making 100,000 or more, but you're not saving nearly as much as you could be. Well, there's a problem because you're now reliant on $100,000 of income. And if something comes up like COVID-19, unexpected layoffs and things like that, then you're kind of stuck in a tough spot because unemployment's not going to cover that whole $100,000 salary they earn. And
So what you mentioned like going from like in development you might start at anywhere between like $30,000 and $60,000, and then hopefully after a few years you're up towards like 90 to over 100. Where in that range is like a good place to just, I don't know, cap your expenses?
Yeah, and so this is kind of another trickier part is because there's so many competing priorities. It's not like you don't come out of college thinking like, oh, I can't wait to retire. I'm just going to start saving and do what I can. Like John said, if you do that stuff earlier on and you get really gung ho about it, yeah, some people can retire early. I actually have one of my clients just recently reach out to me like, hey, I've kind of been interested in trying to see if I can retire in the next 5 to 10 years, which it's going to take a lot of adjustments. But the thing is, there's so many competing priorities. If you have a spouse, if you have children, like it's not just your own expenses you're controlling these other people. You're responsible for these other expenses, and it's hard to say no sometimes. And then, yeah, how big of a house do you need? How fast, how fancy of a car do you need? All these things kind of play into the whole financial picture, and that's why financial planners do exist for the people that do need it, is because there's too many things, and there's there's too many things that you feel like you have to do. But unfortunately, unless you're even millionaires don't make enough money to do everything they could ever dream of instantly. You kind of had to plan these things out and kind of set course of, hey, if these are the things that are important to me, this is how I need to stack these things out. So really it comes down to personal preference, personal priorities and goals. And the problem is a lot of people don't take the time to sit down and talk about these or think about them, especially if they have a spouse or significant other. Like, all right, we'll do the minimum to get our free match in from our 401k with our employer. And hopefully that's enough because we don't really have time. We don't really want to find reasons to have to save more because we want to get the most out of today and kind of maximize your lifestyle. So it's tricky. There's no one point, but one interesting thing is there's been studies that show on a scale of kind of happiness in your income, it does kind of plateau basically at about 70, probably just for inflation, about $80,000 of income. And that's all going to have to be adjusted for where you're living and kind of cost of living in that area. But it's pretty standard across the board that once you get to a certain threshold, really just buying additional stuff isn't really going to increase your happiness as much. You have all the basic necessities, you're well taken care of, you're not going to starve, you're not fearful of anything from a financial standpoint. So usually about that $70,000 to $80,000 range, you can really start to still get the best enjoyment as you can right now out of your life and really start making huge progress after that point as you get those additional raises. And it's hard to do though, right? Because there's always things calling your name. I just had a third child and all three of them, so 3.5 and younger, so they're all in these big bulky car seats. Well, that wasn't fitting in the car that we had, so we had to look for a third row. And it's like, it's one of the things we definitely could have found a way if we needed to keep our expenses lower and just be like, well, one of our kids, we're going to put them in a different type of booster type chair and not be the guidance that's recommended. There's things you can do. And it just kind of comes down to what's comfortable for you. What do you believe is most important to you? And when it comes down to family, most of the time that's what wins out. And so we ended up accepting that additional cost for those types of things. So that stuff comes up. And the cool thing is you do have the control of making that decision. You can decide not to. We could have decided to buy like a beat down van and still kind of got that same capacity for our family. But luckily we're in a position where we don't necessarily have to do that, and we can still kind of hit all of our goals that we have planned.
I think most of my issues come from me telling myself the statement that you just said. Like, I could, go get like the minimum version of X, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
But I make a good salary. I might as well get the good thing. So I end up with like top of the line stove and refrigerator and car and TV and whatever else, and it never ends. And I've got 2 kids that live with me full time, and then 2 that I rent.
Okay.
And family is a huge money sink.
Yep.
I mean, you wouldn't give them up for the world, but at the same time, it's like how much is daycare? Like I got to spend $800 for what?
Yep.
And getting a developer salary, even a modest one like 60, 70, you don't get you don't get any breaks. You got to pay the full daycare cost. There's no financial aid for probably, I would assume, most developers, because we're past that poverty line.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that you kind of start to run into is, well, that's a huge chunk of money. And if you have a partner or spouse that would be working, and it gets really tricky because if their income isn't nearly as high as yours, it's like, well, your income's going to get eaten up by daycare. Like, would you rather spend time with the kids and do daycare? Or like, do you need that space? And some people do need that space to still work, even though it's all going to daycare for the next 3 to 5 years. And then obviously once that's over, then there'll probably be some other sports type things where those get to be pretty expensive depending on what types of leagues you're joining there.
Yeah, and excuse me. And it's easy to fall into that trap too. That there are so many ways that you can spend money. Like you said, there's always something on the radio advertising something that you absolutely have to have. And my wife and I met and didn't marry until we were in our late 20s. So we each had our own house. We had our own cars. We figured out that banks were willing to give us credit cards. So we racked up credit card debt, having a lot of fun throughout our 20s. And it took us a number of years to recover from that. Whereas, if we had been smart about our expenses, we probably could have been in better shape than we are now. Although we're not in bad shape. There's also, I've even gone so far as to with the situation where people aren't really leaving their house too much right now. I've even thought about going down to a single car, and having a conversation like that with my wife probably wouldn't have happened a number of years ago. It's only recently it's only been since we were married that we have those conversations about finances and planning and being more intentional about finances. I'm very much structured. I want to put it into a spreadsheet. I want to have a budget. I want to look to see are we making progress towards our goals and that type of thing. Whereas my wife is very much more emotional, more feelings about those types of things. And when I ask for it in the structure that I'm wanting and needing, that isn't often taken, that isn't heard very well. So I had to learn that the structure, the spreadsheets are my responsibility, are my problem. And having that conversation, if I want to make that plan, then I need to figure out how to get her on board with having that type of conversation where she's also comfortable.
Yeah. Yep. And relationships, right? They're tricky. It's complex. You all have different backgrounds, and that's one of the fun things that I enjoy with Level Up Financial Planning. One of the things is I help significantly younger clients than what I would have traditionally if I stayed working for someone else. So my typical client in the past would have been 56-year-old people a few years out from retirement, but now my youngest clients are like 23, and a lot of these couples are meeting right after this call. I have a meeting where they're engaged, so now they're talking, well, how much are they going to be joining finances? What things do they want to be all in on? And the problem is there's no one right answer, so it takes kind of that communication, and that's super important. And it sounds like you guys figured out more or less to kind of know, I know if I put it this way, I'm not going to get what I need. It's not going to be beneficial. And so you start to figure these things out over time, but also sometimes people don't figure it out because like, oh, that we hit a nerve. We're never having that conversation again. And things don't get better. Things don't kind of get planned out and organized as well as you may like. And yeah, communication is so huge, and it does take kind of figuring out trial and error a little bit to find out, well, how can we communicate so that at least our main goals, those things are known enough to both of you where you can kind of head in that direction and use those goals to help kind of tweak some behavior. Because yeah, if you're racking up credit cards on clothing or video games or drinking, whatever you could spend money on, right? But if you're doing those, but travel is super important to you, and that actually makes you like really happy compared to some of these other things that make you very minimally happy in the short term. Well, if you get on the same page, like, oh, well, we can travel to some really awesome places, but we can't do some of these things or can't do it at that same level. And kind of to Clayton's point there, he's like, oh yeah, there's like all these different things. That's really where people shoot themselves in the foot. Like you can typically have like one or two things, or even with a 6-figure income, some pretty significant areas where you can kind of have upgraded to a T type experiences and products and features and things like that. The problem is when you need it across the board, it makes it very hard to get ahead because yeah, all of a sudden, oh, the next new model's out, the next new year's out. My friends or family have this, and now I kind of feel like I'm falling behind and my stuff's getting ancient. And so that's the tricky thing, is like finding the things that really do matter. And that's one of the things that's helpful to have those conversations, especially when you have a significant other, especially when you have children involved. Like, hey, like, what's the most important? And then let's start building around that. And the cool thing is you can back into it with the spreadsheets or however you want to attack it. You can back in and say, well, since we got our main things covered, it looks like we still got some extra money to play around with. So that's where you can like, well, this extra money could either make that travel better, we can help kids go to school with less student loan debt. It can be whatever you want it to be, but it does help to kind of get clear. Otherwise, you're just going to feel uncomfortable and sometimes angry and frustrated and not understand why. And it's because some financial tension is somewhere in the background there.
Yeah, one of the things you said about like the new models available and all that stuff, that's another trap that I have fallen into. I was in the Army in the early 2000s. I got out like 2000, right when 2008 started. But
Okay.
being in the Army, you change the post that you're at like every 1.5 to 2 years usually. So
Okay.
for 8 years almost, every 2 years, I was dropping everything I had, going to a new place, getting a new apartment, you know, getting all new stuff, switching cars, doing all that stuff because that was just the lifestyle.
Yep.
And so all the way up until about 4 years ago, I kept doing that. Except for I had a family when I got back to the States, so I was buying houses every 2 years, like selling the house and moving, selling the house and moving. And same thing with the car. And one of the biggest traps I fell into was once you've had something of a certain quality level, it's hard to go back down. So like if you've made the mistake, well, I call it a mistake. Right now looking back on it, I consider it a mistake. If you've made the mistake of buying a new car, even a cheap one, like I bought an Aveo for like $11,000. But then after I had that new car, and a couple years had gone by, and you know it didn't smell new anymore, and the carpet had some stuff on it, and you know whatever, it was like I want another car, but I can't just have like this used car that I found for under $1,000. I need a new car, so I go and buy a new car, but this time it was an upgrade. You got to upgrade, so I bought a $20-something-thousand car. And then I bought a $30-something thousand car, and now I've got a $40-something thousand truck, and it's like it never ends. So more of a suggestion for anybody listening than a question is, if you can avoid it, don't ever get into that trap. Like, don't hold out on buying the brand new thing until like you've planned it and saved up for it and whatnot. I never did that. It was just, it's time for a new car, and I make enough money, I'm going to get something nice. And that's, for me at least, that was a bad idea, because unlike John, I don't do spreadsheets and I don't plan. I want everything to be as simple as possible. So if I've got money in my checking account, I'm going to spend it. And that was bad. And so I even today on some things, I keep doing that. Like I blacksmith and I have an anvil, And
cool.
for no discernible reason, one of the people that I follow on YouTube started selling anvils, and I was like, ooh! And so I bought a new anvil. I don't necessarily need it,
Yep.
but but there went $1,600, just new anvil. So
Yeah, and I think that's where that kind of range of that happiness level on that kind of visual chart I was mentioning, like your happiness and your income, basically once you get to 70, 80,000, like when you're spending that money, it's not needed. It's not required to have a good life. It's those extra things and upgraded, which is fine. It's just when you have too many of those things, or they're just super expensive hobbies, super expensive things that you're into, and there's a lot of them. Well, yeah, you might have to be happy like never being able to retire and hoping, at least for the tech clients that are up here in Fort Collins, Colorado, it's a lot of old tech companies and they do mass layoffs. And unfortunately, it is usually the older kind of generation that's targeted for those things, and it's harder for them to find positions after that happens because their salary is like $200,000, and it's just a little bit trickier when they're going out. They get very small window of opportunities that are going to be available, especially if they don't want to move, if they're not able to work remote. And so, yeah, you can do these things as long as you kind of have a plan and understand, like, yep, if I do this, then I'm not going to retire until 70. Or if I do this good thing, maybe I pull these things back, I start to change these habits. And that's kind of what you're talking to, Clayton, is these habits are powerful. You don't realize them and they're there. And it's just like, oh, like clockwork, because that's what you've been doing. You kind of built up that habit that wasn't happening. It's not that you like write it down on a calendar that it's going to happen, like internally. It just kind of magically happens, like, oh, it's about that 2 year mark. I need something new and fresh smelling. And so that's super important to be aware of and just be intentional as you're choosing what it is that you're going to be spending on. Be super intentional and have that understanding. How is this going to affect the other things that are important to you? And that's what it comes down to. You can do a lot of things, especially with the 6 figure income. It's just you probably can't do all of them at once because they kind of compete against each other as far as priorities.
yeah, absolutely. Um, Several minutes ago, you mentioned some 20-somethings that you're about to start helping. I think you said they were like 23 or something.
Yeah. Yep.
To get somebody on the right track, what age is a good age to start really considering that retirement thing? Like, is it
So,
like 12, or is it a little bit later?
yeah. So as soon as you get a job, would make sense, because even if you're going to school and you're working and only getting like 10,000 because you're doing school and you're just getting some like internship or something like that. Well, if you just do like 10% of 10,000, it's $1,000, and from a per paycheck, it's not going to be too noticeable to you, and you're probably just going to waste it anyway. So if you just get in the habit, as soon as you start earning money, that 10% of it is going to go into retirement. You want to start as early as possible. Some of my clients that have teenage children and start to work, they'll do that. They'll start funding a Roth account because their kids basically have no income taxes because they don't earn enough to actually make it into a tax bracket where they're going to have to start paying taxes. And then if you put it in a Roth account, it's going to grow tax free. And so as early as possible. And again, it does come down to kind of those balancing and competing priorities. Is when I've actually been working with that particular couple now for 2 years. And so they're celebrating their anniversary for their wedding. But that was one of the goals that they had initially, is, hey, we want to get married. One thing that was helpful, them meeting with me, it was financially related, but I don't think they were going to get this from working with me, is they actually sat down and talked about like the timeline for when they were going to get married, because he thought it was like 3 or 4 years out and she thought it was like next year or sooner. And just because I was like, hey, well, when is this going to happen? This will help us start to figure out how much should we save monthly so we don't go into credit card debt. And he's like, well, I was thinking like 2 or 3 years. And she was just, I meet all my clients virtually. So just like how I'm seeing you guys, like her face just got super, super frustrated. And she's like, no, like this within the next year. And he's like, whoa, well, yeah, of course, within the next year. And like, all right, I was like, well, that changes from saving like $300 a month to change it to $1,000 a month. And they weren't saving that much previously. So it's like, oh, well, is this important enough? And then they got on board to do that. But obviously, if you have these big, huge goals that are short term and you don't want to go into credit card debt for them, it makes sense to not always save that 10% or 15% of your stuff. But again, it kind of comes down to once you're planning it out, then it's very easy to move these kind of toggles and be like, oh, we know how this is going to impact this. Does that feel fine if we just, instead of putting this on credit card debt and paying 20%, if we save for this, still get your matching with your 401k, but not be as aggressive? Because he was saving, I think, like 12%. At the time, we brought him down to 6% so that they can actually put money in a savings account that said wedding savings on it. And they got really pumped up as they were getting closer and closer that they were going to pay for that thing in cash.
Awesome.
Yeah. So since we've got you here for some free financial advice for ourselves, we'll say, we've talked about how to avoid debt and how to get out of debt and how to start saving when you're young. And let's hypothetically assume that maybe some of that happened, maybe some of it didn't, maybe some of it got paused.
I love hypotheticals.
During our 30s, my wife and I, got to where we are based on any number of choices, and now we've moved to Florida. We have a young child. We're in a good spot, and we're ramping up and prepping for what retirement might look like in a couple of decades. And I also saw a Facebook post from a friend of mine saying that something like when you're 30, you should have 2 or 3 times your salary in retirement. When you're 40, you should have 5 or 6, or whatever the case may be.
Yep.
And looking at those figures, I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm so far behind. So how do you get there if you neglected to contribute when you were younger?
Yeah. Yep. And so it's harder, right? It's going to be harder than a younger John and your wife taking a different route earlier on compared to kind of what we're dealing with now. And that other kind of alternate life version of you is feeling like super confident, not looking at that and being like, oh man, what the heck, how am I going to do this? And so, yeah, there's the benefit. That's one of the reasons why I do help people as early as they want, basically, to start working with me to get this plan in place, because it just gets so much easier. But you're still mid-career, you're still making a high amount of money. It just comes down to being intentional, understanding like, hey, we could have done things a little bit different, but at the end of the day, like, you are where you're at. You still have a job. You still have many years ahead of you to be able to work. So you still are in control. It's just going to be a little bit more aggressive. You're going to have to be with your savings. And maybe because you said yes to so many things in the past, you're going to have to start being a little bit more intentional and saying no to some of the things that you wouldn't have had to otherwise. And so that's really the trick. I created an infograph type situation where, like, how hard it is to make good financial decisions early on. It's super hard. It's really hard because retirement and all of the financial stuff, like, I'll figure that out later, procrastination. And then on the opposite end, like, as you're getting closer to retirement, like, oh, this is super important, I'm going to focus on it. It's easier. It's more important to you. So you're going to spend time on it, but it's more of an uphill battle if you haven't done the things that you need to. And if you do start early and you kind of fight that urge of, oh, retirement's 40, 50 years from now, just tell yourself, well, am I going to miss 5%, 10%, or am I just going to spend it on something that's I'm not going to even remember tomorrow or next month? And how much that could help you, how much more confidently you can stroll into retirement and really be in control of your financial situation. That's what's really important to me, is having confidence and having control over your situation. Because, yeah, even though we had a quick conversation, I think, before we hit the record, that, yeah, software engineers still in high demand, probably will be for the foreseeable future, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a long stretch of employment gap or unemployment gap and having issues there. And that stuff can set you really far behind if you're not in control of what's going on, how much is going out, and having those things kind of nailed down, because that's your first line of defense, is that emergency savings.
Speaking of the emergency savings, do you have like a baseline in relation to someone's salary, like how much they should have set back?
Yeah, so it really depends. If you are a single individual, you'll probably be fine with about 3 months of kind of your salary, 3 months of your expenses that you really need to cover. And if you have a significant other, and if they are not making up an equitable or kind of similar salary as you, then you really want to get closer to 6 months. Because if you have two family members or a whole kind of family relying on that, it gets drained a lot faster than 3 months will actually. So you want to have 6 months there, and kind of gives you additional protection. So that is a rule of thumb, kind of baseline. I'm actually a big fan of doing a little bit more if that's going to make you feel comfortable, because some people just need to see like 100,000, or they need to see 50,000, even if that's above kind of what these targets are. And like, yeah, if that's going to make you sleep better at night, then let's do that. Once we get to that point, that excess savings can go towards your goals and all those other things that are going to be more fun. But it's important to at least start working towards that and having some type of baseline, because something comes up and very quickly, whether it's an emergency or unemployment, and really quickly you can go into credit card debt. And once you get in pretty deep, it's such a hill to climb out of it, because you're paying usually 15 to 22% interest, and you're like, man, I'm paying like so much every single month. Why isn't this going down? The interest is ridiculous, and it's costing you a lot of money. And so, yeah, you definitely, that would be like the biggest thing to avoid. If you can avoid credit cards, you're really gonna be so much better off than the average American, because of the average debt that Americans kind of carry on, that high interest debt. Like cars are only about 4% interest rate. Houses are as low as like 3% interest rate right now. One free tip for anyone listening: if you plan on staying in your home for 2 to 3 years and your interest rate is above like 3.75% currently, you probably want to check out refinancing your mortgage, because there could be some significant savings. Because what I'm seeing here in Colorado, it's about 3%. It's been floating a little bit above that every couple of weeks, but pretty close to 3%, which is ridiculously low in terms of cost.
With the state of things the way they are right now, with COVID and all the uncertainty that there might be around the country, around the world, do you have any specific advice to those that may be you know, weighed down by particular amounts of debt, or what to do if they do have some savings available to them? I'm hopeful that few people are being laid off, and if they are,
Yeah.
then hopefully they can find something relatively quickly, and not be out of work too long,
Yeah.
and incur any more pain uh, than but that hopefully looking to improve possibly as much as they can, as quickly as they can. Are there things that we need to be looking out for, looking towards, planning for, either rainy day, or planning for the sun to return soon?
Yeah, so I think the emergency funds is the biggest thing. Back when that's step one for a lot of my clients, anyways, in general. But I do a lot of content and social media and things like that, and I was trying to make it as obvious as possible. Like, emergency savings is the biggest thing that you want to make sure that you have locked down. Once you kind of get past that, and kind of maybe like a 1B would be, don't be investing funds in stocks if that's not short, or if that's long term money, that's fine. But if it's short term, you don't really want to be investing in any type of stock. I don't care if it's tech or not. Just because things have gone up, those things will get hammered very quickly. We actually saw everything get hammered pretty heavily back in the springtime. It's since almost recovered fully, which is crazy how that happened within a 1 month time span, where we saw some of the highest movements in a week, in a day, and some of the lowest movements in a week and a day, as far as how the stock market percentages work. And that was pretty crazy and insane. But even though things are looking good right now, stock market wise and pricing wise, you never want to have funds that technically are emergency savings, or like, let's say my clients that were getting married, or like, if you have that tied to a particular goal in the next 2 years, do not invest that money. Like, sure, you can make a little bit more, but there's so much more of a downside if you lose 50% of that value, and all of a sudden your spouse or significant other is like, what did you just do? Like, like, you knew we had our wedding coming up. Were we supposed to wait till this comes back before we get married? Maybe I don't want to get married now, or something. So it's like, don't that's one of the big things I've seen too with kind of tech professionals. Like, you learn about the stock market, it's cool, you can make money. It's over long term time horizons, you're going to make more money than the likelihood that you're going to lose it. But in short term time periods, you can get fleeced. And there was the tech bubble back in 2000. There was the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and those were pretty bad. And even tech got hammered. Tech came back pretty strong since then, but everything got hammered across the board basically.
Well, before we start wrapping up, so that we hopefully end on a higher note, are there things that we could start doing or continue doing from here and making the world better for ourselves, better for our families, better for our communities?
Yeah, so make sure you're doing the 401k matching with your employer, even if it's a new employer and you're like, I might not be here in a few months. Just do it. The money you contribute into that, you still get your own money back. When you're not with an employer for a certain time period, you might not get the free money that employer match if you leave within a certain time period. And all employers are a little different as far as how that time period is. But that's important. If your company has an employee stock purchase plan, and this is kind of getting Clayton's, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but yeah, stock options, employee stock purchase plan. Employee stock purchase plan is something you have to opt into, and that means you get a big discount on employer stock, and you can sell it right away and make a guaranteed kind of return. You want to take care and take advantage of that if you can. Make sure you have the emergency savings. I have no problem saying emergency savings like 50 times in a podcast because it's just so important. So those things are big. And then talking, if you have significant others, about like what's the most important. Are we headed in the same direction? What things can we look at? And when it comes to relationships and significant others too, don't be like, you need to change this. Say, hey, this is what I'm going to change. This is what I'm going to do. Kind of lead by example and show like that you're making sacrifices, because what that will do is kind of inspire them to like, whoa, like John volunteered to make this change on something that he actually enjoys. Like, maybe I should consider that. Maybe it's important enough to him to do that. Maybe I should do that. So I think that's another big problem that happens with relationships, is you're the first one to attack, like, oh, I do buy that Yankee candle, which is something maybe like 5-10 years ago with my wife, I used to get frustrated by those things, but I have my own stuff I enjoy. And you just kind of have to understand like what actually matters, and then you can back into those things. As far as helping the community around us, you guys had a charity episode a while back. It was probably like a year and a half ago now, around the holidays, and that's super important to kind of give back to your community. One cool thing is if you have like employer stock that's accumulated and it's going to be like a tax burden to you, it's better off to donate appreciated stock than it is to donate cash, and because of the tax advantages associated with that. So you'll want to make sure that you have a smart kind of tax plan. Taxes are huge for anyone listening. If you're making six figures, there's definitely some tax planning that could be happening, whether it's with your employer stock or things of that nature. But that's one way too of kind of giving back to your community around you and reducing your tax impacts by giving stock instead of cash. And the charity or the organization doesn't care as long as it's the same dollar amount basically, and it definitely helps quite a bit. I think those are big ones. I haven't gotten to this point. My children are young, but I think when you have children, it's important, kind of like how your mother did for you, John, of sharing some type of financial knowledge and wisdom. That's the biggest issue right now. That's why I'm able to have so many clients that need this help, is because you don't get taught this stuff in school. Some of it's complex, sure, but some of it is pretty basic as far as like budgeting, avoiding credit card debts, understanding how to use credit cards. Credit cards actually are a good tool. You can get a lot of free money if you take advantage of the rewards, but pay it off every single month so that you don't ever actually pay interest. And so that's another kind of easy go-to, as long as you make sure that you're not going to trick yourself into accidentally spending more because you get bonuses and rewards. Those bonuses and rewards is only 1 or 2% of that additional cost that you're charging. So you're still spending like $98 more for every additional $100 that you're doing just to get their rewards. And so don't trick yourself like, oh, I'm going to get rewards if I do this, or I get more flight miles. I saw that all the time when I was working in the credit union. Like, people are like, oh yeah, like I get all this. Well, you're paying like 20% in interest, like that. You're paying way more than you're getting in the rewards. So you just, if you're smart about it and you're intentional, you can actually do really awesome things and make like maybe 0.5% of your income back, by running everything through credit cards and doing it diligently and intentionally.
Too lazy for all that.
That come to mind. What was that, Clayton?
I said I'm too. I hate paperwork. I'm too lazy for all that. I'd rather like get rid of the credit cards altogether and never look at them again.
Yeah, you can keep it simple and just run through everything through the very best one. And that's one of the problems that people run into, right? You start adding all these different layers, all these different accounts. If you have a significant other, they have their own accounts. There's different things, like I have one specific to the clients I help that's like a wealth management portal, but you can still access like a mint.com and just have like all the balances feeding in, like, oh, um, her account has this much, my account has this much, and you can kind of have those things lined up. So even though accounts are spread out and all over the place, it still feels organized because you're able to see the balances. Like, yep, I have enough in checking to cover the payment for the credit card in full, and not have to worry about those things. But yeah, getting organized is a huge piece over the years, because every single year it feels like there's an additional line item that you have to account for and keep track of.
So is there anything that we've missed that we haven't talked about that you want to be sure to tell all the young folks entering into tech, or the people that have maybe been in the career for a while?
I think the biggest thing is whether or not you're on track at this point, you are still in control of what that looks like. And again, it might be a little bit more painful of a pill to swallow, but if you start making some significant changes and start making them, you'll feel good about it, and then that does kind of help level up and make that progress. Once you build up your emergency savings, Clayton mentioned that you kind of build these lifestyle expenses and it's hard to go back from there. The same thing happens on the other end. If you see your 401k at a certain amount, if you see your emergency savings at a certain amount, you're like, I don't want that to go down. And so you start to be smarter. You kind of trigger yourself to, because you don't want to feel the pain of falling below 50,000 or 30,000, whatever is in that emergency savings. And with your 401k, you're like, yep, I don't want that to go down. And so you kind of keep plugging away, and maybe you get a raise and you throw a percentage of that raise towards that to start building up that snowball, getting things momentum and compound interest on your side. I don't know if people are familiar with, but there's like easy calculation. If you divide 72 by the rate of return that you expect to get over a certain time period, it'll tell you how long it takes for your account to double. So if you have 7% or 7.2% rate of return and you divide that by 72, it will double every 10 years. So it's pretty crazy how those things can work out. And yeah, the funds that you have now could potentially double in the next 10 years, and that's going to help you. The last thing, kind of on the downside, but just more so to be aware of it, is like inflation is a real thing, and that's the cost of things going up every day. That's why you don't put things in just a savings account only, because your savings account, you're getting 0.05%. Hopefully when you're investing, you're going to get a return that's greater than inflation, which on average is about 2.5% to 3% a year. And so that's why investing and putting stuff in a retirement account is so important, because you want your purchasing power to outgrow what inflation does. Because if you just put it in your pillow, if you put it in a savings account, it's not going to grow fast enough, and it's actually going to lose value every single year.
But the emergency funds, is that in a savings account, or is that somewhere that's another highly accessible account somewhere?
Basically a savings account. What I end up doing with my clients is there are some like more purely 100% online based savings accounts where you might get like a 1% interest rate right now. It's not a lot. It's not going to keep up with inflation, but it'll be better than the 0.05%. That one's just kind of smart emergency money. You do have to recognize that, yep, it's not going to grow for you, but it is going to protect you from going into credit card debt, which is 22%. So credit card debt is worse than inflation. And so that's kind of how I build this hierarchy of kind of thinking.
Okay. So for any of our listeners who might be interested in hearing more pearls of wisdom, or who might want to contact you for official financial advice, do you have any social media that they might be able to reach you at?
Yep. So I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and YouTube technically. So I'm on all those social media platforms. The best way would probably just go to my website, levelupfinancialplanning.com. And that's linked to all my social sites. I do strategy guides, which are basically blog posts. I do cheat sheets, which are infographics. I do video posts, and I also started a podcast last year where I cover financial topics. I cover the stock options and things, Clayton, if you want to check those out. And then I rotate in different kind of techies, people that share their story and background as far as how they got into tech, kind of what they are really passionate about moving forward, and those types of things. So yeah, feel free to check it out. And then if any of this kind of hit a nerve and you're like, yeah, I need to really get things figured out, you can easily schedule a complimentary meeting there too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Yep. Perfect. And we'll be sure to have all those links to those in the show notes as well. Do you have any other resources that you might recommend to people to check out that are either looking to get out of debt or looking to learn more about investing or anything along those lines?
Yeah, so I think the most straightforward one would be like a Dave Ramsey type style course if you're trying to get out of debt. Dave Ramsey is really good at budgeting and getting out of debt. As far as like investing, one thing I don't like about referring any particular things is because there's so many different ways you can go with it. So I don't want to highlight one thing if it's not going to be a good fit for someone. But there is a lot of information out there. That's one of the things I don't cover too much in my videos because of compliance reasons. I can't say, hey, you should do this or that in terms of how much you should be investing or what types of things you should be investing in. But I do cover kind of why you should be investing and how to think about those types of things. But yeah, you do an online search, you're going to find quite a bit. Reddit, you might find some gold there, but you might find some garbage too. So you'll definitely probably want to look at 3 or 4 different kind of areas and make sure it doesn't sound too good to be true, because there's a lot of people sometimes trying to sell something. Then there's a lot of people that, what's that called? That syndrome where you just learn a little bit, all of a sudden you think you're an expert. And so, but as you gain experience, you start to realize.
Drug dealers. They give you just a little taste.
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Dunning-Kruger.
But yeah, drug dealers, yeah, probably had that same type of thing. But yeah, you get a little bit of experience. And so a lot of that is what you'll see too. So you'll want to make sure that you've got a long track record of anyone that you're looking at following, because you don't want someone that just read a book or just did something one way and they're not aware of all the different options and ways that you can approach these things.
Yeah, I definitely highly recommend the tailored approach. So be sure to reach out for Lucas or reach out to my mother, and maybe she can set you up with the financial planner as well. But with that, really appreciate you, Lucas, appreciate you coming on and talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John and Clayton.
That was Lucas Casarez. Lucas is a fiduciary, certified financial planner, and founder of Level Up Financial Planning, Power Up Tax Planning Service, and host of Techie Personal Finance Bootcamp.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And be sure to catch us live each week on Twitch and follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
And I'm Clayton Hunt.